Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up a documentary-style study to organize and list evidence of a fascinating and honestly, a highly debated phenomenon in the modern online sphere. We're looking at how certain online ministries and digital personalities present these massive, sweeping claims of divine encounters and prophetic words. But more importantly, we are going to impartially examine how and why these exact same narratives often mysteriously shift, change, or just disappear entirely. We are talking about claims that pull in millions of views. They shape the faith of countless followers, and they direct the spiritual lives of very real people who are just out there seeking genuine guidance. So this explainer is going to map out exactly how our sources are tracing these shifting stories straight back to Gabe and Troy's unethical monetizing of God for personal gain and fame. Now, it is incredibly important to note right up front that this explainer is a full summary derived directly from our curated sources. We're drawing our case studies today from two specific, meticulously researched investigations. The first is by Justin Peters Ministries, and the second comes from the Scattered Sheep podcast. A link is below in the description box. You can go and watch their full investigations for yourself. And honestly, as a quick reminder to our audience, prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated for the grueling work they do in documenting all this information. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda. We're going to look at claims of divine encounters, Gabe Poirot's contradictions, Troy Black's shifting prophecies, the Catherine Crick connection, monetizing faith and fame, and finally, evaluating the evidence. Let's open our first case file, sections 1 and 2, claims of divine encounters, and Gabe Poirot's contradictions. Our source for this first section, Justin Peters Ministries, meticulously documents Gabe Poirot's claims of spending 18 days in heaven while he was in a coma. But, as the source points out, some really stark contradictions immediately emerge when you just sit down and compare Gabe's own interviews. It honestly creates a bizarre sense of emotional whiplash. For example, in an account given to Pastor Alan Jackson, Gabe claimed that the moment he arrived in heaven, he was utterly terrified. His exact words were, "I'm done for." He deeply believed this black and white list of all his life's mistakes was about to be pulled up for review. He described being overwhelmingly concerned about his sins and his failures. But, in a completely separate interview with Sid Roth, Gabe painted a drastically different picture. He claimed he had absolutely no fear, not an ounce of it. He confidently stated that rejection simply does not exist in heaven. The source highlights this as a textbook example of a story shifting depending on who happens to be in the audience. I mean, it raises a perfectly logical question, right? How could someone possibly forget the core, overwhelming emotion of their very first moment arriving in the afterlife? And, the discrepancies don't just stop at his personal emotions, they completely alter the theological nature of Jesus himself. When he was speaking to Alan Jackson, Gabe stated that when Jesus asks you a question, he already knows the answer. He described this all-knowing Jesus who understands the innermost thoughts and intents of your heart long before you can even open your mouth to speak them. Makes sense, right? Yet, in another interview with Joseph Z., Gabe suddenly presented a Jesus who was genuinely unaware and completely perplexed by Gabe's earthly concerns. He claimed Jesus simply didn't know what Gabe was worried about. The source rightfully points out that both of these descriptions literally cannot be true at the same time. You can't have an omniscient, all-knowing God who is simultaneously baffled by human thoughts. It fundamentally calls into question the consistency and, frankly, the very reality of this entire heavenly account. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the storytelling issues actually extend way beyond the interviews and right into the specific theological errors and extra-biblical claims found in Gabe's published book, 18 Days in Heaven. Let's look at what the source found. Gabe claims he literally saw his own name, Gabriel, written on Jesus' physical wounds, his wrists, his head, his side. He also claims that Jesus looked at him and told him he was his one and only favorite. Furthermore, Gabe alleges Jesus instructed him to go back to Earth and tell his family who he really is. The source notes this directly contradicts the standard biblical stance that Scripture already provides the complete and final revelation of Jesus. But perhaps the most wild part is how Gabe attempts to excuse the sheer length of his highly detailed 30,000-word book. He claims the Apostle Paul didn't describe heaven in the Bible simply because Paul couldn't find the English words for it. The source quickly and rather easily corrects this using the original Greek texts, proving Paul specifically stated it was not lawful or permitted for a man to utter what he saw. So Paul didn't lack the vocabulary, right? He lacked the divine permission. Which brings us to perhaps the most glaring, undeniable contradiction in Gabe's entire narrative. During the Alan Jackson interview, the host playfully asked Gabe directly if he saw angels, playing off his name, Gabriel. Gabe's exact response was, "I don't remember any angels."
He then rationalized this total lack of memory by claiming angels are so reverent they don't even want you to look at them. Okay. However, in an earlier interview with Sid Roth and a live studio audience, a woman from the crowd asked him specifically about the seraphim. Well, suddenly, Gabe had incredibly vivid, highly detailed memories. He described them as having this glorious shine, acting like a mirror reflection. When pressed on whether he saw eyeballs on them, Gabe enthusiastically confirmed it, claiming the eyes were everywhere, yet in one place at the same exact time. I mean, you simply cannot tell one host you deny seeing a single angel and then turn around and describe eyeball-covered shiny seraphim to another host just a short time later. And as the source also importantly notes, Gabe's own book explicitly details seeing and being transported by angelic beings.
The shifting descriptions even extend to historical biblical figures. This one is really something. When asked on the Blurry Creatures podcast if he saw Moses, Gabe described him as this tough, brawny guy, literally called him a Middle Eastern lumberjack and a salty old character you wouldn't want to mess around with. But flip back just a few months prior with Joseph Z, and Gabe claimed he saw Moses at the burning bush and described him as weak, emaciated, and looking like he was less than nothing, like a puny, scrawny weakling. The source uses this to illustrate a much broader, much more concerning point. The storyteller is adapting the physical appearance of biblical figures to suit the exact flavor of the specific show he is guest starring on. If he's on a podcast about mysterious, tough creatures, Moses suddenly becomes a tough lumberjack. The narrative is just constantly molded to fit the moment. This brings us to a really powerful quote from Justin Peters that impartially summarizes this entire phenomenon perfectly. He states, regarding these so-called heavenly tourists, they not only contradict each other, they end up contradicting themselves. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. The sheer volume of intricate details required to sustain these grand, sweeping narratives eventually causes the whole story to collapse under its own weight, exposing a massive lack of truthfulness right at the core of the claims. This is exactly why the source argues we must always verify, rather than just blindly trusting a compelling emotional story. The stakes are simply too high when it comes to spiritual truth. Let's transition to our second case file, Section 3, Troy Black's Shifting Prophecies. To truly understand the evidence against online prophet Troy Black, we have to map out a very clear chronological timeline of his shifting stances regarding a minister named Catherine Crick. Over just a 3-year period, his narrative completely reverses. As you can see, in 2022, he starts with a full-throated, enthusiastic endorsement of her. By 2024, as public controversies start bubbling up, he issues a highly calculated walkback. And finally, in 2025, he releases an upload of absolute full condemnation. The source asks a brilliant and vital question here. If Troy is truly speaking for an unchanging God, why does the divine message change so drastically over this exact timeline? So, the story begins in February 2022. Troy Black released a recording titled, God Spoke to Me About Catherine Crick. In this upload, Troy claimed the Holy Spirit actually convicted him for being secretly jealous of Crick's rapid online growth. But he went way further than that. He claimed God explicitly told him her ministry was amazing, and he publicly encouraged people in the Netherlands to go support her upcoming events. Now, the Scattered Sheep podcast suggests Troy did this strategically to align her actual scheduled events with his own previous prophecies about a Netherlands revival. But here is the absolutely critical piece of evidence. Troy, a guy who frequently insists to his audience that he never deletes his content, has actually scrubbed this specific 2022 endorsement from public view on his channel. It's gone, hidden as private. It really begs the question, if this was a genuine, eternal word spoken directly by God himself, why on earth would it be quietly scrubbed from the internet? So why delete the proof? That brings us to Section 4, the Catherine Crick connection. Well, as heavily documented by the source, Catherine Crick's ministry began exhibiting severe theological errors and highly alarming, cult-like behaviors. Followers were instructed to literally call her spiritual mama and were documented bowing down prostrate at her feet to lay gifts. There were also recorded instances of her demanding money, notoriously telling a frantic mother she needed to sow a financial seed before Crick would deliver her child from a supposed demon. Add to this a highly theatrical, entirely unbiblical form of demonology where congregants would sit patiently for hours just waiting for scheduled, synchronized manifestations. And perhaps most distressingly of all, the source outlines her deep, ongoing connections to a spiritual father named George Davey, a man exposed for horrific abuses, whom Crick actively defended against the victims. These are severe, incredibly damaging allegations that highlight exactly what Troy Black was suddenly trying to avoid being associated with. Because of these rapidly escalating controversies, Troy Black realized he had to pivot, and fast. In a 2024 update outlining a supposed prophetic dream, Troy tries to kind of split the bill.
He acknowledges the severe cult-like issues we just discussed, but still claims God told him she is not a false minister. She's just in error. He asserted she essentially had a good heart and just needed some gentle encouragement. Yet fast forward to 2025, the wheels have completely fallen off Crick's reputation in the broader public eye. Suddenly, Troy releases a brand new upload titled, "God told me it's time to come out against Catherine Crick," claiming she is now actively pushing an ungodly agenda. And that presents a massive logical and theological problem, leading us directly to this crucial question raised by the source. Did an omniscient God change his mind, or did Troy change his story? Think about it. If God knows all things, past, present, and future, how could he endorse a ministry as amazing in 2022, declare it merely an error in 2024 while asking for encouragement, only to suddenly realize it was completely ungodly and needed total condemnation in 2025? The source argues strongly that these were never messages from God at all. They were calculated public relations moves by Troy Black to manage his personal brand and distance himself from a sinking ship. Let's move to and see how this builds into our fifth section, monetizing faith and fame. It's right here that the documentary sources synthesize the overarching motives behind both of our case studies today. The findings impartially demonstrate a very clear link between shifting narratives and the unethical monetization for personal gain. Look at the breakdown. For Gabe Poirot, the tactic is constantly shifting his heavenly stories to magically fit the specific audience of whichever interview he happens to be doing that day. The apparent motive? To continue his media tours, maintain his relevance in a crowded space, and ultimately drive sales for his book. For Troy Black, the tactic involves deleting old, failed prophecies and issuing brand new, contradictory words from God to conveniently explain away his past endorsements. His apparent motive? Protecting his personal brand, insulating his reputation from a toxic association, and maintaining his highly lucrative 590,000 subscriber count. This brings us to a really poignant quote from Anthony Wade of the Scattered Sheep podcast regarding Troy Black's hidden 2022 endorsement. He notes the reason why he removed it is he's changing a story about what this video was. It perfectly highlights the deeply calculated nature of erasing your digital history. When the physical evidence directly contradicts the shiny new narrative being spun for the audience, the absolute easiest solution for these personalities is to simply delete the past and claim God gave them a new word. It reveals a priority of brand management and damage control over any kind of actual spiritual authenticity. And that brings us to our final section for today, evaluating the evidence. Here is the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. How do we properly evaluate online spiritual claims in the digital age? The sources we've cited today passionately argue that viewers must absolutely stop blindly trusting the emotional, ever-shifting narratives of online personalities. Just because someone claims to have been to heaven or claims God told them a very specific message, we cannot just look at their massive subscriber count or the high production value of their content and assume it's true. We have to rely on structured, scriptural evaluation. We must check the receipts, we must watch the timelines, and we must hold these claims up to a standard of truth that doesn't just change because the wind of public opinion happens to shift. That brings our investigation to a close. As a reminder, this explainer was a full summary of the evidence compiled by our sources. We highly encourage you to dig deeper into everything we discussed. A link is below in the description box for the full source material. And, of course, prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us as we explored the structure behind these stories, and we'll see you next time.